My name is Thomas Bennett, and I've been a paramedic for 23 years. I've seen more deaths than I care to count. Hundreds, easily. I've held the hands of elderly patients taking their last breaths, performed desperate CPR on teenagers who didn't make it, witnessed the final moments of cancer patients, heart attacks, strokes, and every other way the human body can fail. Death, in my profession, becomes almost routine after a while. You develop a clinical detachment. You learn to see death as a biological process. The heart stops pumping, the brain stops firing, the cells run out of oxygen. It's mechanics, chemistry, physics, measurable, predictable, scientific. Or so I thought, until the morning of October 12th, 2006, when I experienced something that completely shattered every rational explanation I'd built my career upon. I was working in Italy at the time, stationed at Milan Central Hospital in the Lombardy region. I'd moved from Chicago 5 years earlier, following my wife Elena, who'd gotten a research position at the University of Milan. The transition to Italy took time, learning Italian, adapting to a different healthcare system, navigating new protocols. But after 5 years, I'd found my rhythm. Emergency medicine is universal. The human body doesn't care what country you're in when it's failing. That October morning started like any other night shift winding down. I'd been on duty since 10 p.m. the previous evening. A busy night with a cardiac arrest, a motorcycle accident, a diabetic emergency, a respiratory crisis. The usual mix that fills a night shift in a major city. By 6 a.m., I was exhausted. Your body knows it should be sleeping, but adrenaline keeps you moving. I'd learned to survive on coffee and willpower. By that morning, I was on my third espresso, sitting in the staff lounge, trying to rest for the last hour of my shift. I checked the clock, 6:17 a.m., 43 minutes until I could go home. That's when my radio crackled. Bennett, we need you at San Gerardo in Monza. Priority transport for a pediatric case. Terminal situation. Family requested paramedic presence for support purposes. I frowned. San Gerardo Hospital in Monza was about 20 minutes away, and support purposes was unusual. Typically, paramedics are called for active emergencies, not comfort care, but I didn't question it. You learn not to question strange requests. I grabbed my jacket, radioed confirmation, and headed to the ambulance bay. The drive to Monza was quiet and contemplative. My partner that night had already gone off duty, so I made the trip alone. The streets were empty in that pre-dawn darkness. Streetlights casting orange pools on wet pavement. It had rained earlier. The air had that clean, cold smell that comes after a storm. When I arrived at San Gerardo Hospital, I was met by a nurse in the pediatric intensive care unit. She was in her 50s, with tired eyes that held a particular kind of sadness, the look of someone who'd spent the night watching a child die. Her face showed the weariness that comes from bearing witness to suffering. You cannot prevent, cannot ease, can only accompany with professional compassion. "Thank you for coming," she said in Italian, which I understood well enough by then. The family, they wanted someone present, someone experienced with... She paused, searching for the right words, her voice catching slightly. With transitions, someone who understands what happens at the end. "How old is the patient?" I asked, following her through the sterile corridors, my footsteps echoing off the polished floors. The hospital was quiet at this hour, that peculiar stillness of medical facilities in the pre-dawn hours when most patients are sleeping and only emergency staff move through the halls. 15, a boy, Carlo Acutis. He's been in a coma since yesterday evening. Leukemia, M3 type. Very aggressive. He has a cerebral hemorrhage. The doctors say it's a matter of minutes now, maybe an hour at most. 15 years old. God, I hated pediatric cases more than anything else. No matter how much professional distance you tried to maintain over the years, watching a child die never got easier. I'd seen it too many times. The devastating unfairness of young lives cut short, the inconsolable grief of parents, the empty rooms that should have held decades more of laughter. We took an elevator up to the 4th floor, walked down another long corridor painted in those institutional greens and whites that all hospitals seem to favor. The nurse stopped outside a room, number 412, I remember that detail clearly, and turned to me. "The family is very spiritual," she said quietly. "Catholics, very devout. The boy was special, they say. Even the doctors who treated him said there was something different about him. very peaceful, even with the pain. He asked for last rites yesterday before he went into the coma. I nodded. I'd encountered deeply religious families before. Their faith sometimes provided comfort, sometimes made things harder. I tried to be respectful regardless of my own beliefs, which, to be honest, were fairly agnostic after years of seeing suffering that seemed random and meaningless. I understand, I said. I'll be respectful. How many family members are with him? His mother and father, a few close friends of the family, and Father Gianfranco, their parish priest. She opened the door and I stepped into room 412. The first thing I noticed was how small the boy looked in the hospital bed. At 15, Carlo Acutis should have been gangly, awkward, caught in that transition between boy and man. Instead, he seemed tiny, diminished by illness. His dark hair was slightly long, falling across a pale forehead. His eyes were closed, his breathing assisted by a ventilator that hissed rhythmically in the quiet room. IV lines ran from his thin arms, and monitors beeped softly, tracking vital signs that I could see were deteriorating. His blood pressure was dropping, heart rate becoming irregular. His mother sat in a chair pulled close to the bed, holding one of his hands. She was an elegant woman in her 40s, her face ravaged by grief and exhaustion. The father stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes red-rimmed. A priest in black stood near the window, rosary beads moving through his fingers. Two other adults, perhaps family friends, stood respectfully near the door. The mother looked up when I entered. "Thank you for coming," she said in accented English, somehow knowing I was American. "You're the paramedic?" "Yes, ma'am. Thomas Bennett. I'm here to be present. Whatever you need." She nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "He's going soon. The doctors said very soon. I just wanted someone here who understands, someone who's seen." She couldn't finish. She didn't need to. I understood. Sometimes families needed witnesses, professionals who could validate what was happening, who could provide some measure of comfort through experience. I moved to the other side of the bed, positioning myself where I could monitor Carlo's vitals on the screens without intruding on the family's space. The readings confirmed what the nurse had told me. This young man was in his final minutes or hours. His oxygen saturation was dropping despite the ventilator support, his blood pressure barely registering. His body was shutting down. I checked my watch. 6:32 a.m. The sun would be rising soon, though you couldn't tell from the sealed hospital window. And that's when it started. At first, I thought it was nothing. Just the hospital's air conditioning kicking in, maybe. A slight chill in the air, barely noticeable. I'd been warm from the walk through the hospital, my uniform retaining heat from moving through the corridors, and the cooling sensation felt almost pleasant, like stepping into an air-conditioned building on a hot summer day. Refreshing, welcome even. But within seconds, literally seconds, not minutes, the chill intensified. And not gradually, the way temperature normally shifts. It came in waves, distinct waves of cold air that seemed to press against my skin, seeping through my uniform like water through cloth. Each wave was colder than the last, building in intensity with alarming speed. I've worked in plenty of cold environments over the years. Chicago winters can be brutal, with wind-chill driving temperatures down to -20, -30 degrees Fahrenheit. I've responded to emergencies in blizzards, worked accident scenes in sub-zero weather, performed CPR on frozen ground while snow fell around me. I know cold. I understand cold. Cold is just temperature, just the absence of heat, just molecules moving more slowly. But this was different. Within maybe 30 seconds of first noticing the chill, I was legitimately uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable that makes you want to reach for a jacket, to rub your arms, to move around to generate body heat. I glanced at the thermostat on the wall near the door, thinking maybe someone had accidentally adjusted it. Maybe there was a malfunction in the climate control system. 22 degrees Celsius, about 72 Fahrenheit. Perfect room temperature, comfortable, warm even, for a hospital that usually kept things slightly cool. Yet I was cold, not just chilly, cold. The kind of cold that penetrates. I could see my breath starting to condense in small puffs, visible in the fluorescent light. That shouldn't have been possible. You don't see your breath at 72 degrees. Basic physics, basic meteorology. It doesn't happen, but it was happening. My medical training kicked in immediately, running through diagnostic possibilities. Was I having some kind of physiological crisis? Was my circulation failing? Was I experiencing some weird neurological event that was creating the sensation of cold? I checked my own pulse. Normal. My hands weren't clammy or discolored. No numbness, no tingling. I wasn't having a stroke or a heart attack or any other medical emergency that might create strange sensory experiences. So if it wasn't me, was it the environment? I looked at the air vents in the ceiling. No unusual airflow visible. No frost forming around them. I walked closer to the window. Sealed tight, double-paned, no draft whatsoever. I touched the wall. Normal temperature, not radiating cold. The floor, the ceiling, the medical equipment, everything was normal temperature, except the air itself. The air in that room was cold, objectively, measurably cold, despite what the thermostat claimed. And here's what made it truly bizarre. The cold wasn't uniform throughout the room. It was focused, concentrated, most intense in the immediate space surrounding Carlo's bed. Like standing next to an open industrial freezer, that kind of sharp, biting cold that makes your skin prickle and your muscles tense involuntarily. But there was no freezer. There was just a dying boy in a hospital bed, surrounded by medical equipment that generated heat, not cold. I noticed other people reacting too. The mother pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, her hands rubbing her arms unconsciously. The father had moved closer to her, wrapping one arm around her as if to share body heat. The priest looked up from his whispered prayers, his breath suddenly visible as he murmured Latin, his eyes widening with confusion or recognition. I couldn't tell which. "Is the heating broken?" the father asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking loudly might disturb his dying son. One of the family friends, a woman in her 50s who I later learned was Carlo's godmother, moved to check the thermostat. "It says 22 degrees, she reported, her own voice puzzled. "It should be comfortable, warm even." But she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. We all felt it. All of us in that room were experiencing the same impossible thing. I moved closer to Carlo's bedside, professional instinct pulling me toward the patient, even as every other instinct I possessed was telling me to step back, to get away from whatever was happening. The cold intensified dramatically with proximity. Standing directly beside his bed, I could feel it penetrating through my uniform, through my skin, settling into my bones with a physical weight. It was the kind of cold that makes your teeth chatter involuntarily, that makes your fingers stiff and clumsy, that turns your breath into clouds of vapor. The kind of cold you feel in deep winter when you're underdressed and far from shelter. Dangerous cold. The kind that could cause hypothermia if you were exposed to it for too long. Yet according to every instrument in that room, the temperature was normal. The digital thermometer on the wall said 22 degrees. The climate control panel showed no malfunction. And most bizarrely, when I carefully touched Carlo's hand to check him, standard procedure, checking for circulation, for skin temperature, his skin was warm. Actually warm. Feverish even, from the infection still raging through his leukemia-ravaged body. The thermometer clipped to his finger showed his body temperature, holding steady at 37.2 degrees Celsius, slightly elevated, normal for someone fighting infection. His skin felt hot to my touch. The medical readings said warm. The equipment said warm. His body was warm, but the air around him was freezing. The contradiction was maddening. I'm a man of science, trained to trust instruments and measurements. If the thermometer says 72 degrees, it's 72 degrees. If my hands tell me something is warm and the thermometer confirms it, then it's warm. That's how reality works. That's how physics works. Temperature is temperature. Except in that room, on that morning, reality was behaving in ways that made no sense whatsoever. By 6:37 a.m., I remember checking my watch, needing the concrete fact of the time to anchor me to something measurable, something normal. The cold had become almost unbearable. I was shivering despite my best efforts to remain professional and composed. My hands were trembling, whether from cold or adrenaline or confusion, I couldn't tell. Maybe all three. The mother had wrapped herself entirely in a blanket that someone had brought from somewhere, pulling it tight around her body like a cocoon. The father had put on his jacket, though I'd seen him remove it earlier because the hospital had felt warm. The priest's prayers had become faster, more urgent, his breath forming small clouds in front of his face with every word of Latin. "Something's happening," the mother whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you feel it? Tell me you feel it. Tell me I'm not losing my mind." "I feel it," I confirmed. What else could I say? Denying it would have been absurd, would have been cruel. "Yes, ma'am. I feel it too. It's like..." She struggled for words, her eyes fixed on her son's pale face. "Like the air before a storm. That electric feeling. But cold. So cold. Like winter. Like..." She paused, then said something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, like a doorway opening. To somewhere else. That was exactly what it felt like. I hadn't had words for it until she said it, but that was it. That was the sensation. Not just temperature, not just physical cold. There was something else happening, something that went beyond meteorology or thermodynamics. The air itself felt different, charged, pregnant with something, like the atmosphere was thinning, like the boundary between this space and somewhere else was becoming permeable. I've never been a particularly spiritual or religious person. My parents were nominal Christians, the kind who went to church on Christmas and Easter and figured that was enough. I'd never felt a calling toward faith, never experienced anything I'd describe as mystical or supernatural. I believed in what I could see, touch, measure. I believed in science, in medicine, in the material world. But standing in that room, experiencing that impossible cold, I felt something that challenged every assumption I'd ever made about the nature of reality. I checked Carlo's vital signs again, needing to do something medical, something in my wheelhouse. His blood pressure had dropped further, 60/40 now, critically low. His heart rate was becoming more irregular, the rhythm on the screen showing increasing ectopy, premature beats, the classic pattern of a heart struggling to maintain function. His oxygen saturation was hovering around 85%, despite maximum ventilator support. These were the signs I'd seen hundreds of times before. The body's final shutdown sequence, death approaching with its biological inevitability. But the cold was something else entirely, something beyond biology. At 6:39 a.m., the temperature seemed to plummet even further. I wouldn't have thought it possible. It was already so cold I could barely stand it. But somehow it got worse, dramatically worse. I watched in complete disbelief as frost began forming on the metal bed rails. Actual frost, delicate, crystalline patterns spreading across the stainless steel like ice flowers growing on a winter window. Beautiful and completely impossible. I touched it with my fingertip. Real ice, cold and wet as it began melting against my warm skin. Real, physical frost, forming in a room that every thermometer insisted was 72 degrees. The priest had stopped his prayers entirely and was staring at the frost with wide eyes. "Madre di Dio," he whispered. "Mother of God." His hand moved to make the sign of the cross, his fingers trembling. Carlo's mother was weeping quietly, but there was something in her expression that wasn't just grief. There was recognition there, confirmation, as if she'd expected something like this. As if this cold somehow made sense to her in a way it didn't to me. "He was always different," she said, speaking to no one in particular, her voice soft but certain. "Even as a baby, there was something about him. Light. The sisters at his school said he was touched by grace, that God had chosen him for something special. I always knew. A mother knows. I always knew he was meant for something beyond this world. I wanted to offer rational comfort, to explain this away as some kind of HVAC malfunction or atmospheric anomaly or something, anything that would fit into my understanding of how the world worked. But I couldn't, because I was experiencing it too, because the evidence was right in front of me. Frost forming at room temperature, breath visible in supposedly warm air, a cold that defied every law of physics I'd ever learned. The cold continued to evolve, to change. It was no longer just temperature, no longer just a physical sensation. It had become something more, something that touched deeper than skin, deeper than nerve endings. My chest felt tight, but not from fear exactly, not from panic. It was more like recognition, like my body was responding to something it instinctively understood even though my conscious mind didn't. I found myself thinking about all the deaths I'd witnessed in my career. Hundreds of them. Thousands, probably. If you counted all the DOAs, all the unsuccessful resuscitations, all the terminal cases where we'd simply provided comfort care until the end. That moment when life leaves the body, medicine can tell you when the heart stops, when the brain ceases electrical activity, when the last measurable vital sign flatlines. We can be very precise about the mechanics of death, but we can't tell you what happens to the person. Where does consciousness go? Where does the self, the soul, whatever you want to call it, where does that go? Is there a moment of separation, a transition? Does something actually leave the body beyond measurable biology? Standing in that room, experiencing that impossible cold, I found myself wondering if this happened at every death, if there was always this moment, this transition, this thinning of the boundary between here and wherever we go next. Maybe most of the time it's invisible, imperceptible, happening on some level we can't detect with our instruments or our senses. But maybe, sometimes with certain people, in certain circumstances, it becomes visible, tangible, felt. Maybe what I was experiencing wasn't an anomaly. Maybe it was just reality, showing itself more clearly than usual. At 6:42 a.m., Carlo's breathing changed. Even with the ventilator mechanically pushing air into his lungs, his body's own respiratory drive was failing. The machine was breathing for him, but his body was no longer cooperating, no longer responding. The monitor alarm sounded, a sharp, insistent beep that meant oxygen saturation was dropping below critical levels. His heart rate was becoming increasingly erratic, the rhythm on the screen showing what we call an agonal pattern, the heart's last, desperate attempts to maintain function before complete failure. I've seen this pattern hundreds of times. I know what it means. It means you have minutes, maybe less. It means the end is imminent and inevitable. The cold intensified one more time, reaching a peak that was almost physically painful. It felt like being plunged into Arctic water, that shock of cold that steals your breath and makes your heart stutter, like standing naked in a blizzard, like frost forming inside your lungs with every breath. My entire body was shaking violently. My teeth were chattering so hard I could hear them clicking together. My fingers had gone numb, the extremities losing circulation as my body tried to protect my core temperature. This was beyond uncomfortable. This was approaching the level of dangerous cold, the kind that requires immediate intervention to prevent hypothermia. Yet underneath all the physical discomfort, beneath the shaking and the numbness and the painful cold, I felt something else, something that defied description, a sense of presence. Not a physical presence. There were still just the same 6 people in the room who'd been there all along, but something else, as if we weren't alone, as if the room had become crowded with invisible witnesses. The air felt thick, heavy, like the atmosphere had substance, weight, like I was breathing something more dense than normal air. Every breath required effort, not because I couldn't get oxygen, but because the act of breathing had become significant somehow, meaningful, as if each breath was participating in something larger than just gas exchange. The mother had leaned forward, pressing her forehead against her son's hand, her tears falling onto his skin. "Go with God, Carlo," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Go with Jesus. Our Lady is waiting for you. Go home, my beautiful boy. Go home to heaven." The priest had resumed his prayers, but softly now, reverently. His voice was barely audible, but I could make out some of the Latin. "In manus tuas, Domine, commendamus spiritum eius." Into your hands, Lord, we commend his spirit. Traditional prayers for the dying, words that had been spoken over countless deathbeds for centuries. Carlo's heart rate dropped precipitously. 60 beats per minute, 50, 40. The blood pressure was barely registering, 40 over 20, then 30 over 15, dropping below what could sustain life. His body was dying according to every medical parameter I knew how to measure, shutting down with the inexorable logic of biology. And the cold reached its absolute apex. I can't adequately describe what happened in those final seconds before death. I've tried many times over the years to find words for it, and I always fail. Language wasn't designed to capture experiences like this, but I'll try. The temperature in that room felt like it dropped to winter depths, Arctic, polar, colder than anything I'd ever experienced. If I'd had to guess, I would have said it felt like -20 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe colder. Cold enough to cause instant frostbite, cold enough to kill. Yet simultaneously, contradictorily, there was warmth. Not physical warmth. The physical sensation was absolutely freezing, but something else. A warmth in my chest, spreading outward toward my extremities. A warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with, I don't know how to describe it, emotion, presence, love. Two completely contradictory sensations existing in the same moment, in the same space. Freezing cold and profound warmth, both utterly real, both undeniable. The air itself seemed to vibrate, not with sound exactly. The room was quiet except for the ventilator's mechanical breathing and the soft beeping of monitors, but with something else. Energy, maybe. Potential. Like the moment before lightning strikes, when you can feel electricity in the air even before you see the flash. I felt like the room had become thin. That's the only way I can describe it. Thin. As if the walls between this world and somewhere else had worn gossamer thin. As if with just a little more pressure, they might tear completely, and we'd see through to whatever lies beyond. It felt like standing at the edge of an ocean at night. You can hear the waves, feel the spray on your face, sense the vast presence of all that water, even though you can't see it in the darkness. You know there's something immense right there in front of you, something powerful and mysterious and much larger than yourself. That's what it felt like, standing at the edge of something vast, something I couldn't see but could undeniably feel. At 6:45 a.m. exactly, I know because I looked at my watch at that precise moment, needing to record the time of death as I'd done hundreds of times before. Carlo Acutis' heart stopped beating. The monitor flatlined with that distinctive sound every medical professional knows too well. A single sustained tone replacing the rhythmic beeping that had marked each heartbeat. The EKG trace on the screen showed a flat line, no electrical activity, no contractions, no blood being pumped through vessels. The ventilator continued its mechanical breathing, pushing air into lungs that no longer needed it, into a body that could no longer use oxygen. By every medical definition, by every measurable parameter, Carlo Acutis had died. And in that exact moment, not a second before, not a second after, but in perfect synchronization with that final heartbeat, the cold vanished. Not gradually, not fading away over minutes or even seconds, instantly, completely, like someone had flipped a switch, turned off a machine, closed a door that had been standing wide open. One moment, the room was arctic, unbearable, frost on the bed rails, and breath visible in the air, and cold penetrating to the core of my bones. The next moment, it was gone, entirely gone. Room temperature returned so abruptly it was almost shocking. The sudden absence of cold was as noticeable as the cold itself had been. My body, which had been shaking violently, began to still. My teeth stopped chattering. My fingers started to regain sensation as blood flow returned to my extremities. The fog of my breath disappeared mid-exhale, there 1 second and gone the next. I looked at the thermometer on the wall, still reading 22 degrees Celsius, exactly as it had throughout the entire experience. The frost on the metal bed rails was already melting, leaving only wet trails as evidence it had ever existed. Within seconds, even that evidence was evaporating, leaving the metal dry and normal, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. I stood there, stunned, my body still trembling from the adrenaline and the aftermath of that impossible cold. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I'd just experienced, trying to fit it into some framework of understanding that made sense. But there was no framework, no explanation, no rational way to account for what had just happened. The room felt normal again, just a regular hospital room where a teenage boy had died, temperature controlled, sterile, filled with medical equipment and the quiet sounds of machinery. Unremarkable, ordinary, except for what we'd all just experienced. The mother collapsed forward onto the bed, her body racked with sobs, her hands clutching her son's still warm body. The sound that came from her was primal, ancient, the sound of a mother losing a child, a grief so profound it transcends language or culture or time. The father wrapped his arms around her from behind, his own tears finally falling freely. his composure shattered by the finality of death. The priest moved forward, placing one hand gently on the boy's forehead, beginning the prayers for the newly deceased. His voice was steady but thick with emotion. "Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. May his soul and all the souls of the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen." The other family friends were crying quietly, holding each other, their faces reflecting a complex mixture of grief and something else. Something that looked almost like awe, wonder, as if they'd witnessed something extraordinary, even in the midst of tragedy. I performed my professional duties mechanically, moving through the familiar routine that follows every death. I checked for vital signs, though I knew there would be none. I looked for any sign of pulse, of respiration, of life, finding nothing, as expected. I made note of the time, 6:45 a.m., October 12, 2006. I began disconnecting the monitors, silencing the alarms, removing the IV lines with practiced efficiency. My hands were steady. They always are. 23 years of experience means you can perform these tasks even when your mind is somewhere else entirely. Even when everything you thought you understood about reality has just been challenged. But inside, I was anything but steady. Inside, I was reeling. I gave the family privacy, stepping back toward the door, letting them have these first moments alone with their son's body. This was their time for goodbye, for final words, for beginning the impossible process of accepting that he was gone. I busied myself with paperwork, with the clinical documentation that death requires, writing notes that seemed absurdly inadequate. Time of death, 6:45 a.m. Cause, cardiac arrest secondary to acute leukemia M3 with cerebral hemorrhage. Family present, priest administered last rites. Death was peaceful. Peaceful, was that the right word? Medically speaking, yes. There had been no struggle, no apparent suffering in those final moments. Carlo had been unconscious, his pain managed, his body simply shutting down as damaged systems failed one after another. A good death, as we sometimes say in medicine, meaning without trauma or terror. But peaceful didn't begin to capture what had actually happened in that room. Before I left, I needed to speak with the attending physician who would sign the death certificate. I found him in the hallway outside, Dr. Lombardi, a pediatric oncologist I'd worked with before. He was in his 60s, a kind man with sad eyes that came from treating too many dying children over too many years. "It's done?" he asked quietly. "Yes." 6:45. He went peacefully, surrounded by family. Dr. Lombardi nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "I'll come sign the certificate. That boy..." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "I've been a doctor for 37 years. I've treated hundreds of children with cancer, but I've never met a child like Carlo. The way he faced his illness, the faith he had, the concern he showed for others even when he was suffering himself. Extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary." "Doctor," I said, needing to know if he'd heard. "Did anyone mention anything unusual this morning? About the room temperature?" He looked up, his expression suddenly intense. "You felt it too?" "Yes. The cold. It was impossible," he finished. "I know. I was in the room briefly around 6:30. I've never experienced anything like it. The nurses have been talking about it. None of us can explain it. The climate control system shows no malfunction. The temperature readings never changed. Yet everyone who was in that room felt it." "Why, what do you think it was?" Dr. Lombardi was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, careful. "I'm a scientist. I don't make claims about things I can't prove. But I'll tell you this. In my many years of medicine, I've occasionally witnessed things that don't fit neatly into our scientific understanding. Recoveries that shouldn't have been possible. Symptoms that couldn't be explained by known pathology. And sometimes, with patients who were special somehow. There were phenomena we couldn't account for." He looked directly at me, his eyes serious. "Carlo's mother asked me if I believed he was a saint. I told her I can't make theological judgments, that's not my area. But I can tell her that her son was the most extraordinary young person I've ever treated. And if what we experienced this morning is any indication, then perhaps there are realities beyond what medical science can currently measure or explain." Before I left the room, the mother caught my arm, Her face was ravaged by grief, but her eyes were clear, certain. "You felt it," she said. Not a question, a statement. I nodded. "Yes, the cold. I felt it. It was angels," she said with absolute conviction, "coming for him. I've read about this. When someone very holy dies, sometimes there are signs. Unexplained cold. The presence of heaven drawing near to collect a soul. You felt it because you were meant to witness, to testify." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to offer a medical explanation, but I had none. Instead, I just said, "I'm very sorry for your loss. Your son seemed like a remarkable person." "He was a saint," she said firmly. "The world will know it someday, and you'll remember this moment. You'll remember what you felt when heaven came to take him home." I left the hospital as the sun was rising over Monza. The streets were beginning to fill with morning traffic. The world continued its normal rhythms, oblivious to what had just happened in room 412. I sat in my vehicle for a long time, unable to drive, trying to process the experience. In my career, I developed certain beliefs about death. I thought I understood it as a purely biological process. The cessation of electrical activity in the brain, the stopping of the heart, the failure of organs. Clinical, measurable, final. But what I'd experienced in that room challenged everything. The cold had been real. I hadn't imagined it. Others felt it too. The frost on the bed rails had been physical, tangible, yet it defied every law of thermodynamics I knew. It had no source, no explanation, and it disappeared the instant death occurred. Was it possible that death involved more than biology? That there was something, consciousness, soul, spirit, whatever you wanted to call it, that existed beyond measurable phenomena, and that in certain circumstances, with certain people, that transition became perceptible to those nearby. I'd always prided myself on being rational, skeptical, scientific, but science is supposed to follow evidence, even when that evidence challenges your assumptions. And the evidence I'd just experienced was undeniable. The days following Carlo's death were strange. I found myself thinking about him constantly, researching his story online. I learned that he'd been an exceptional young man, deeply religious, devoted to the Eucharist, passionate about using technology to spread faith. He'd created a website cataloging Eucharistic miracles from around the world. He'd been kind, generous, always thinking of others, despite his own suffering. I also learned that even before his death, people who knew him talked about his sanctity. Teachers, classmates, priests, they all said there was something different about Carlo, a depth of faith and maturity beyond his years, a peace and joy that seemed to transcend normal human experience. I talked to other hospital staff who'd been involved in Carlo's care during his brief illness. Every one of them mentioned something unusual. The way he'd accepted his diagnosis with calm courage, how he'd asked for communion and the anointing of the sick without fear, how he'd spoken about offering his suffering for the Pope and the Church. For a 15-year-old facing death, his spiritual maturity was extraordinary. But when I asked if anyone else had experienced the cold that morning, responses were mixed. Some people had felt something unusual, but couldn't quite describe it. Others noticed nothing. It seemed that the intensity of the experience varied. Some felt it acutely, others only peripherally, and still others not at all. I wondered why I'd felt it so strongly. I wasn't particularly religious. I hadn't known Carlo. I was just a paramedic doing my job. Yet the experience had been undeniable, profound, and in some way I couldn't articulate. Transformative. About 2 weeks after Carlo's death, I attended a memorial service for him at his parish church, Santa Maria Segreta in Milan. I'm not sure why I went. Professional curiosity maybe, or something deeper. A need to understand what I'd witnessed, to connect it to a larger story. The church was packed. Hundreds of people had come to remember this teenage boy. Photo displays showed Carlo at various ages. A beautiful child with dark eyes and a radiant smile, growing into a handsome young man. There were images of him at his computer, working on his website, pictures of him at Mass, receiving communion with obvious devotion. Photos with his family, with friends, always with that distinctive smile. Person after person stood to share memories. His computer teacher talked about his technical brilliance. His catechism instructor spoke of his theological insights. Friends remembered his kindness, his humor, his genuine interest in their lives. Everyone mentioned his faith, not as something separate from who he was, but as the core of his identity. And then his mother spoke. She talked about the morning of his death, about the inexplicable cold that had filled the room, about her conviction that it was a sign of heaven's presence, angels coming to escort her son home. She spoke with such certainty, such peace despite her grief, that I found myself believing her. The doctor said it was medically inexplicable, she told the congregation. The paramedic who was there confirmed it. Everyone in the room felt it. A cold that had no natural source, that vanished the moment Carlo's heart stopped. I believe it was God's way of showing us that death is not the end, that Carlo's soul was being welcomed into paradise, that holiness is real, and heaven is real, and we have every reason for hope. After the service, I approached her. She recognized me immediately. "You came," she said, taking my hands. "Thank you." "I needed to understand," I told her. "What happened that morning? I can't explain it, and I'm someone who's supposed to have explanations for everything." She smiled gently. "Some things can't be explained, only experienced. You were given a gift that morning, a glimpse beyond the veil. Don't try to rationalize it away. Let it change you." "I'm not a religious person," I said. "I don't know if I believe in saints or angels or any of it." "You didn't believe," she corrected. "Past tense. But you felt what you felt. You can't unfeel it. The question now is what you do with that experience. Do you dismiss it because it doesn't fit your worldview? Or do you let it expand your understanding of what's possible?" Those words stayed with me. Over the following months and years, I found myself unable to dismiss what had happened. The experience was too visceral, too real. It had shaken my certainty about the nature of reality, about what happens when we die, about whether there's more to existence than physical matter and biological processes. I didn't suddenly become devoutly religious. I didn't convert to Catholicism or start attending church regularly, but I did become open to the possibility that consciousness might continue beyond death, open to the idea that some people might be more attuned to spiritual realities than others, open to mystery, to things that can't be measured or quantified, but are no less real for their immeasurability. My work as a paramedic changed too. I found myself more present with dying patients, more attentive to the moment of death. I wondered if what I'd experienced with Carlo happened to some degree at every death, that thin place where this world meets whatever comes next. Maybe most of the time, we're too busy with medical protocols and emotional reactions to notice, but maybe it's always there, that moment of transition, waiting for us to be still enough to perceive it. I also found myself thinking more about the lives I encountered in emergency situations, not just as medical cases or bodies to stabilize, but as human beings with souls, with inherent dignity, regardless of their condition or circumstances. Carlo's death had reminded me that each person I treated was infinitely valuable, infinitely precious. That reminder made me a better paramedic, and I think a better person. Years later, I learned that Carlo Acutis had been declared venerable by the Catholic Church, the first step toward official recognition of his sanctity. His cause for beatification was progressing. People were reporting miracles through his intercession. His story was spreading around the world, inspiring young people to live their faith with the same passion and joy he demonstrated. And then, in 2020, he was beatified, declared Blessed Carlo Acutis, one step away from official sainthood. When I heard the news, I wasn't surprised. I'd been in that room. I'd felt what happened when he died. If that wasn't the death of a holy person, I don't know what would be. In 2025, Carlo Acutis was canonized, officially declared a saint by the Catholic Church. St. Carlo Acutis, the youngest contemporary saint, patron of the internet generation. His body, which had been exhumed and found to be incorrupt, now rests in Assisi, where thousands of pilgrims come to pray at his tomb. I'm retired now, living back in Chicago with Elena. My paramedic days are behind me, but I still think about that October morning in Monza, about the boy who died at 15, and the inexplicable cold that accompanied his death. People sometimes ask me if I'm certain about what I experienced, if maybe it was some kind of hallucination, or a shared delusion, or an explainable phenomenon that I simply didn't understand at the time. My answer is always the same. I know what I felt, I know what others in that room felt. I know that frost formed on metal at room temperature, that our breath was visible in air that thermometers said was warm, that a cold beyond any natural cold I'd ever experienced filled that space and vanished the instant a 15-year-old boy's heart stopped beating. I don't claim to understand it. I don't have a scientific explanation that satisfies my rational mind, but I also can't deny the reality of what happened. And more importantly, I can't deny how it changed me, opened me to dimensions of existence I'd previously dismissed, reminded me that there's more to life and death than what we can measure and quantify. Was it angels coming for Carlo's soul, as his mother believed? Was it some kind of spiritual energy released at the moment of death? Was it a glimpse of the supernatural breaking through into our natural world? I don't know. I may never know, but I know that on the morning of October 12th, 2006, I stood in a hospital room in Monza, Italy, and experienced something that transcended my understanding of reality. I felt a cold that had no source, that defied physical laws, that seemed to emanate from the space between worlds. And I witnessed the death of a young man who, even in dying, manifested something extraordinary. Saint Carlo Acutis, as he's known now, lived only 15 years. But in those years, he touched countless lives with his faith, his joy, and his conviction that God is real and present in our world. And when he died, even a skeptical American paramedic felt the presence of something beyond this world, something holy, something eternal, something that whispered of mysteries we're not meant to fully understand in this life. The cold I felt that morning was inexplicable by any scientific standard I know, but it was real as the boy who died, as real as the grief of his parents, as real as the faith that sustained them through their loss. And 20 years later, I'm still trying to understand what it meant, still wondering if I was given a gift that morning, a moment of perception beyond normal human experience, a glimpse of what happens when heaven reaches down to claim one of its own. Over these 2 decades, I've had time to reflect deeply on that experience, to consider it from every angle, to test it against my evolving understanding of life and death and what lies between. Some days I wake up convinced it was exactly what Carlo's mother said, angels coming to collect a holy soul, the boundary between worlds becoming permeable for just those few minutes. Other days, my skeptical scientific mind reasserts itself, and I find myself searching again for natural explanations, though none ever quite fit the facts. What I've come to realize is that perhaps the point isn't to have a definitive explanation. Perhaps the value of the experience lies not in understanding it completely, but in allowing it to hold space in my life for mystery, for wonder, for the possibility that our current models of reality are incomplete. Science is supposed to be humble, acknowledging what we don't know, remaining open to new discoveries that challenge our assumptions. Yet somewhere along the way, many of us in medicine develop a kind of arrogant certainty, as if we've figured everything out, as if consciousness is just neurons firing and death is just biology stopping. That morning in Monza taught me humility, real humility, the kind that comes from standing face to face with something you cannot explain away, cannot categorize, cannot fit into your neat intellectual frameworks. It's uncomfortable, that kind of humility. It means living with uncertainty, with questions that have no clear answers. But it's also strangely freeing. It means you don't have to pretend you understand everything. You can simply witness, experience, and remain open to possibilities. I think often about the other people in that room that morning. Carlo's parents, who have spent these years keeping their son's memory alive, promoting his message, seeing him officially recognized as a saint by the church. The priest, who I learned later said it was one of the most profound spiritual experiences of his long ministry. The family friends who were there, whose faith was deepened by what they witnessed. We were bound together by that shared experience, connected by having felt something that defied normal explanation. In a strange way, we became witnesses, not just to a death, but to something larger, to a moment when the invisible became briefly, terrifyingly, beautifully visible. I've told this story to only a handful of people over the years. Most medical colleagues would dismiss it out of hand. Elena knows, of course. I came home that morning and told her everything, my hands still trembling, my certainty shaken. She listened without judgment, held me while I tried to process it. She's a scientist too, but she's always been more comfortable with mystery than I am. more willing to acknowledge that our instruments and theories don't capture everything that exists. A few other paramedics know, people I trust, who've worked emergency medicine long enough to have their own stories of strange things witnessed, inexplicable moments, experiences that don't fit the official narrative of what death is supposed to be. There's a kind of underground knowledge among first responders, medical professionals who've been there for enough deaths to recognize that something more is happening than what the monitors show. We don't talk about it openly because admitting you believe in phenomena that can't be measured or replicated makes you seem unprofessional, unscientific, maybe even unstable. But in quiet conversations, over coffee after difficult shifts, the stories come out. The dying patient who seemed to be looking at something invisible in the corner of the room, the sudden feeling of presence just as someone passes, the unexpected peace that sometimes fills a room at the moment of death, the sense that something, consciousness, soul, whatever you want to call it, departs the body and goes somewhere. Carlo Acutis' death gave me language for these experiences, helped me understand that what I felt wasn't unique or crazy, but part of a larger mystery that humans have been encountering throughout history. Every religious tradition has stories of saints whose deaths were accompanied by signs and wonders. Lights in the room, unexplained fragrances, temperature changes, the sense of angelic presence. Perhaps what made Carlo's death unusual wasn't that these phenomena occurred, but that they were intense enough for even a skeptical paramedic to feel them unmistakably. I've visited his tomb in Assisi twice now. The first time was about 5 years ago, during a trip Elena and I took to Italy. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Closure, maybe, understanding, or just the need to close a circle, to connect the dying boy I'd seen in that hospital room with the saint he'd become. The shrine is beautiful, simple, but elegant. Carlo's body rests in a glass casket, dressed in jeans and sneakers. His typical outfit, his mother insisted, because he was just a normal teenager who happened to be extraordinarily holy. Pilgrims come from all over the world, many of them young people who see in Carlo a model of how to live faith authentically in the modern age. Standing there, looking at his peaceful face, so much like it had been that morning in the hospital, but now preserved, incorrupt, a sign the church points to as evidence of his sanctity. I felt a strange sense of completion. I'd been there when he left this world. Now, I was seeing the evidence that the church at least believed he'd arrived somewhere else, that his life and death meant something, that the cold I'd felt might truly have been what his mother claimed, heaven coming near. The second visit was just last year, after his canonization. The crowds were enormous, the energy different, celebratory rather than merely reverent. St. Carlo Acutis was now officially recognized, his feast day established, his intercession sought by millions. I stood in line with pilgrims from 6 continents, each with their own stories of how Carlo had touched their lives, their own testimonies of prayers answered through his intercession. An old Italian woman ahead of me in line asked why I'd come. I told her, simply, briefly, that I'd been present at his death. Her eyes widened, filled with tears. "Then you are blessed," she said, "to witness a saint's entrance into heaven. What a gift, what a tremendous gift." I'd never thought of it that way, as a gift rather than just a disturbing, inexplicable experience. But maybe she was right. Maybe being unsettled, having your certainty challenged, being open to mystery, maybe those are gifts too, even when they're uncomfortable. These days, as I said, I'm retired. I spend my time reading, traveling with Elena, volunteering occasionally with a free clinic in our neighborhood. The adrenaline-filled nights of emergency medicine are behind me. But Carlo Acutis' death remains the most vivid, most significant medical experience of my entire career. Not because it was the most dramatic. I've seen far more traumatic, more sudden, more tragic deaths. Not because it was the most medically interesting. The progression of his leukemia was textbook, unfortunately common. But because it was the only death where I felt the veil thin, where I experienced something that suggested death is more than biology, where I glimpsed, or thought I glimpsed, or felt I glimpsed, the possibility that consciousness continues, that souls exist, that there might be something waiting for us beyond the final heartbeat. I don't know if I'll understand it fully even in my own final moments. Maybe death is the only truly reliable teacher about death, and I won't have my answers until I experience it myself. But I'm less afraid than I used to be, less certain that death is simply oblivion, simply cessation. If what I felt in Carlo's room was real, and I believe it was, then death is a transition, not an ending, a doorway opening, not a door slamming shut. That's what the cold felt like, ultimately, like a doorway opening, like something coming through, or someone going through, like the barrier between here and there becoming permeable, transparent, crossable, like witnessing not a termination, but a transformation, not an ending, but a beginning. I may never fully understand, but I'll never forget, and I'll never stop being grateful that I was there, in that room, at that moment, when the boundary between earth and eternity became thin enough to feel the cold wind of something infinite passing through. When I was given the gift, and yes, I've come to see it as a gift, of witnessing a soul's journey from this world to whatever comes next. St. Carlo Acutis lived only 15 years on this earth, but in those years, and in his death, and in the nearly 2 decades since, he's taught me more about the nature of existence than all my medical training ever did. He's reminded me that we are more than biology, that consciousness is more than neurons, that death is more than failure of bodily systems. He's opened my eyes to mysteries I'm not meant to fully comprehend, but can humbly acknowledge and reverence. The cold I felt that morning was inexplicable by any scientific standard I know, but it was real as anything I've ever experienced, and it was significant, not just physically significant, though the physical aspects were undeniable, but spiritually significant, a sign, a witness, a glimpse of something that exists beyond what we can normally perceive. And for that glimpse, uncomfortable as it was, challenging as it remains, I am profoundly grateful. If this testimony touches your heart, I encourage you to learn more about St. Carlo Acutis and ask for his intercession in your prayers. Subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications for more stories that inspire faith and hope in our journey toward heaven.